Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of public webinars to describe the start of a feasibility study for wind energy generation in the Great Lakes. I am Cheryl Huber with NYSERDA's Great Lakes Wind Team and will be leading us through today's presentation. Today, we will describe New York State's ambitious renewable energy goals, the laws and policies that inform those targets, and the order to conduct a Great Lakes wind feasibility study. We will outline the details and topics covered by the study, milestones to present preliminary findings to the public during subsequent webinars, and collect feedback from you, the public, about how you would like to participate in the process in consideration of the study's development. Next slide, please. But before we begin, I would like to mention a few points of webinar logistics. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar. You may submit a question to our question and answer period via the Q&A feature anytime throughout the presentation. The chat is disabled, but you will be able to communicate with the Great Lakes Wind Team and panelists via the Q&A. Later, we will ask you to participate in a live poll, which will appear in the side column of your screen. Today's webinar is being recorded. The slide deck and recording will be posted to NYSERDA's Great Lakes Wind website in the near future. If any technical problems should arise during the webinar, please email Sal Graven at the address shown here. Next slide, please. And now, without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome NYSERDA's Acting President and CEO, Doreen Harris, who will offer introductory remarks.
Thank you, Cheryl, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I welcome all of you who are in attendance for the kickoff of this important work. We are here to learn more about the Great Lakes Wind Feasibility Study and how it will commence. But before we dive into that, I want to take a few minutes to discuss NYSERDA's new mission and vision. We developed this new mission and vision to better align with New York's clean energy transition and growing green economy, as you see here. And as I should note, in addition to our new mission and vision, we recently issued our 3-year strategic outlook, which will guide our work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while advancing renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies, as well as build the clean energy economy and grow a resilient and distributed energy system. We at NYSERDA want to ensure our top objectives are properly in focus and framed to deliver meaningful and tangible results for all New Yorkers by providing expertise, guidance, and investments in technologies of tomorrow, which will help with our efforts to not only combat climate change, but also build an inclusive clean energy economy, support quality clean energy jobs, and foster healthy and resilient communities. And it's significant to note that as we work to achieve our ambitious climate goals as set forth by the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, we have to not only look at all possible resources, but also all sound science and data as available. And as co-chair of the Climate Action Council that the Climate Act established, NYSERDA, in partnership with our state colleagues, remain technologically agnostic when it comes to selecting the best solutions to help us reach our climate goals. We don't know exactly what mix of solutions will get us to carbon neutrality, but we do know that we need a broad set of options, including many that are not yet being deployed, to hit the goals of the Climate Act. So as NYSERDA has done with previous research studies, our goal with the Great Lakes Feasibility Study is to objectively and diligently collect as much information and data as possible. This information will be synthesized into a feasibility study that will describe the opportunities, risks, benefits, and challenges of this potential renewable energy resource and how it could potentially fit into the portfolio of other renewable energy resources being advanced to fulfill the goals of the Climate Act. As you will hear today, the study is now underway and is expected to be completed by the end of this year and released in 2022. In addition, as the study moves forward, there will be ample opportunity for the public to provide feedback, and I personally encourage you to participate, reach out, and share your input and perspectives. Collective thinking must contribute to meaningful action so that we can ensure a cleaner, healthier future for generations to come. So thank you for attending this informational webinar today, and I will now turn it back to Cheryl to continue with the next phase of the webinar. Cheryl?
Thank you very much, Doreen. Next slide, please. The agenda for today's webinar outlines the topics covered during today's presentation. First, we will describe the policies that have set in motion the creation of a Great Lakes wind feasibility study, including the New York State Climate Act and the Clean Energy Standard. Next, we will explain the origin of the study and describe its components and authors in greater detail. Afterward, we will ask for your help to understand the best method for your engagement, input, and participation in this process throughout the coming year. Finally, we will outline next steps and answer your questions about what has been presented today and on the study itself. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Adrienne Downey, who will talk about the state's renewable energy goals and portfolio.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. So good morning, everyone. My name is Adrienne Downey. I'm the principal engineer with NYSERDA's large-scale renewables team working on this feasibility study. And indeed, as reflected in the comments that Doreen offered to kick us off, really we wanted to start our conversation today by sharing, some of the foundational background that helps to inform, where we are today and what our goals are as a state. So indeed, we are actively working and foundationally working on this topic, Great Lakes wind feasibility, under the premise of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the so-called Climate Act, as we say. So the next slide, please. When we think about the Climate Act, it's important that we understand it to be a broad and sweeping series of legislative actions that collectively and collaboratively work to put our state's clean energy goals into very sharp focus. We are tasked by our state legislators with implementation of this act that was enacted in 2019. And we start with a really important foundational goal of a clean energy economy, which we've been working very diligently to build here in the state. To date and now, we have nearly 159,000 clean energy jobs as part of our economic foundation. And this continues to be a major goal as we think about our clean energy ambitions and the goals of this act, that we keep a very sharp focus on the intersectional opportunity between a clean energy future and a clean economy future, and notably an inclusive clean economy future. A major pillar of our work is to advance renewable energy. So by 2025, we are working to advance 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar, as well as comprehensively a resilient and distributed grid, with a heavy emphasis on helping to integrate not only transmission opportunities and efficiencies, but also up to 1,500 megawatts of energy storage. By 2030, our state's goal is to have 70% renewable energy delivered, electricity delivered from renewable energy sources. This goal is further enshrined by the Clean Energy Standard, which is the regulatory framework enabled by the New York State Public Service Commission to help us provide the roadmap for the achievement of many of the precepts of the Climate Act. So by 2030, again, we will be focusing on a major target statewide of 70% electricity from renewable energy, as well as an interim milestone of 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 levels by this time. We will continue our progress with 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. And here, just again, to disambiguate a little bit, when we speak about offshore wind, we're speaking about the advancement of wind being developed in the Atlantic Ocean. And that is an active portfolio of development consistent with the orders of the Clean Energy Standard that NYSERDA is helping to lead. By 2040, we anticipate having 100% zero emissions electricity on our grid. That is an incredibly ambitious target, and one that we look to all resources to help us to achieve, per the observations from Doreen setting us off. But foundationally, the ultimate goal of the Climate Act is to service an 85% reduction in greenhouse gases from 1990 levels by 2050. I think we can all appreciate that these are really extraordinary goals and a comprehensive set of actions across our clean energy future to help us enable those outcomes. Next slide, please. So here today, we are focused on a prospective technology, a novel technology, and as Doreen indicated, we have to keep our eyes open as a state as to what the potential technologies could be to service what is an incredibly ambitious and aggressive target of 100% zero emission electricity by 2040. That is the subject of when we start to think about the prospect of Great Lakes wind. It's in this banner of complementary technologies that we as a state need to look at very carefully in order to service these incredibly ambitious goals. Next slide, please. And it is a topic that we bring up with the benefit of experience to date in working to really service what has been an incredibly significant statewide ramp up of renewable energy activities over the past many years. To date, we have awarded more than 90 projects that together service more than 10,800 megawatts of renewable energy projects. This speaks to our land-based portfolio of onshore wind and solar, as well as our offshore wind portfolio with 5 projects offshore in the Atlantic Ocean in active development. Really, this map, I think, gives a very strong sense of how we are looking very closely at, the opportunities that can be afforded, the growth potential of many clean energy resources, as well as their integration into a comprehensive network. And so as we turn to the conversation which will inform our webinar today with regards to the Great Lakes wind feasibility, again, we do this from the perspective of understanding the diversity of resources that are potentially available, as well as the challenges that are present as we seek to advance our goals in a way that is responsible and well informed. And so with that, if we turn to the next slide, please. Thank you. So with that, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Greglantman, who will help to orient us as to the terms of the Public Service Commission's order for the Clean Energy Standard and what this specifically directs NYSERDA to deliver. That is the subject of this webinar and of subsequent webinars on this topic. Greg?
Thank you, Adrian, and good morning, everyone. My name is Greglantman. I manage NYSERDA's environmental research program. The intent of that program is to inform energy and environmental policy with science and data. So a large portion of this feasibility study really fits well within the wheelhouse of the work that my team does here at NYSERDA. Just to set the stage a little bit on the content and structure of the feasibility study, again, as Adrian suggested, this is really predicated on the fact that the state has very ambitious goals to advance renewable energy across the state and an interest in broadening the portfolio to assure that we can achieve that goal with resiliency. With that in mind, we had been approached by a number of stakeholders over the past year or two suggesting that Great Lakes wind should be considered in that portfolio. In order to better understand the issues and opportunities around Great Lakes wind, we included Great Lakes wind as a potential feasibility study in a white paper filing with the Public Service Commission. We described the fact that there is a lot of information that is unclear or uncertain to us that, if aggregated and considered, might provide some stronger direction for Great Lakes wind, how and if it can fit within our portfolio of renewable energy. And so we presented that again in a white paper to the Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission put that out for public comment, and a large number of comments were received from the public and from stakeholders about the viability of Great Lakes wind. Many of these comments were very supportive of the positive aspects of Great Lakes wind around the economic development opportunities and our ability to achieve our clean energy goals in a timely manner, while other stakeholders suggested issues and concerns with it relating to wildlife, viewshed, and other issues. As a result, the Public Service Commission released an order requiring NYSERDA to advance a feasibility study in an even-handed manner. And to commence that work within 180 days, the Public Service Commission also provided a $1 million budget to accomplish that work. So with that backdrop, we'll go to the next slide, please. So in thinking about how to assemble a feasibility study that would provide a broad-based assessment of Great Lakes wind, first, we needed to think about the spatial aspects of it. And from this map, you can see that we are considering both Lake Erie and Lake Ontario as parts of the feasibility study. And that is what I would describe as spatial consideration in a sense. But additionally, you can see there are major differences in the depth profiles of these two lakes. So Lake Erie is relatively challenged in most of what New York, within New York's borders, is less than 50 meters. While Lake Ontario has a steeply sloping shoreline coming from the South Shore, and it deepens quite quickly. So that again is a spatial consideration in this context, but it also leads into the temporal consideration for us. So, and by that I mean the technology development and available technologies consideration. So we're thinking about Great Lakes wind within the context of the goals of renewable energy that the state has. This includes 70% renewable energy by 2030, a 0% emission grid by 2040, and an 85% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. And so as the technology development timeline continues, we can think about how those technologies can come on the scene and be employed to advance the renewable energy goals across the state. And this again is all predicated on the Climate Act, as Adrian was mentioning, and making sure that we're able to achieve our goals in a cost-effective and timely manner. Can I get the next slide, please? So the first thing we tried to do in order to get our minds around what should be included in the feasibility study was to start thinking about all the various aspects that needed to be aggregated in this consideration. In doing so, there are, as I mentioned earlier, technology considerations around icing and emerging technologies around fixed foundations and floating foundations and timelines associated. Each of those operate under different weather conditions, wind speeds, and icing and climate conditions. And there's also obviously environmental conditions. So these are the types of factors that have to get thought about as we start to frame the study. And in fact, what it suggests is this study needs to be very dynamic. Certain site conditions will allow for fixed foundations, while other site conditions may require floating foundations. They may be on different development timelines, and as a result, their timing in which they would come into play will be different. That plays into their relative costs. That also plays into where they can be deployed, whether the power generated from those sites can be interconnected, and so forth. So again, we are looking at both the technology development timeline, as well as how that affects siting and spacing, as well as the other things that come into play for consideration. So that includes, as I say, for technology, larger machines may require additional port infrastructures and incur additional investments in ports, while they may also produce a higher energy output per unit area being used by the turbines. So these are all considerations that press against each other. And so as we went through this process, we needed to be really careful that we were selecting contractors that both could work well together, but would bring in all of these different pieces and mesh them in a way that we could inform the Public Service Commission's potential next steps on advancing Great Lakes wind energy. So I'll talk more about each of these individual components in just a moment. Can I get the next slide, please? So the way we've structured this feasibility study is for NYSERDA, it's obviously NYSERDA's feasibility study to execute on. We've been framing and working to bring folks on board to support the work. We've gone through competitive state procurements to identify the right folks to do the work. And what we've organized is a system whereby a feasibility study is going to be constructed and drafted by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They will also be developing some components of that study. In addition, we're working with a team of Patera and Brattle to work on the grid infrastructure components, so understanding how energy can be injected into the grid and what that deliverability looks like. And we're also supporting that work with Advisian, which is a team that's going to be working on the environmental concerns and regulatory processes. These teams necessarily have to work together. If NREL is advancing a timeline for a new technology, then that's going to produce a different energy output, which is going to play into our grid interconnection opportunities. It's also going to alter the manner in which that project is installed in the lakes, which is going to affect some environmental conditions and other stakeholder concerns, which plays into Envision's role in the process. So these individuals, these different teams are going to be necessarily coordinating very closely together, but are experts in the aspects of the projects that they're working on. And again, we are trying to make sure that the public is actively engaged in this process and the stakeholders know how the project is developing. So we're kicking this off with this first webinar, which is outlining the framework for our project. We're going to have in the second quarter of 2021 another public webinar to discuss progress on the aspects that have been evolving. In the third quarter, we're going to have another update on that project. And then the fourth quarter, we'll have a webinar discussing the draft study, so how it's all coming together. And then finally, the project will be released again late in 2021 and released to the public early in 2022. So this is the framework in which we put it together. And now I'll move into some of the more specifics for each of the contractors. Get the next slide, please. As I mentioned, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is in a rather unique position to think about the technologies that can be deployed in the Great Lakes. Great Lakes and lake wind projects in general are an emerging technology. Some components of it, such as fixed foundations, are market ready. And some of the others, such as floating technologies and perhaps some icing conditions, are a little more emerging. And so NREL has been investigating technology options for a while and has a stronger understanding of those than most potential support contractors could provide. So they're going to be looking at the infrastructure and physical constraints associated with technology deployment. They're going to be assessing the timeline and technology development of new products that can allow us to put turbines in deeper waters, perhaps, or minimize their footprint in the place in which they're installed. And they'll also be looking at some of the site conditions that necessitate the selection of technology. So thinking again about an ice climate, thinking about wave action, the sediment structures and the geophysical conditions that would allow projects to be built. So again, thinking about technology and coupling with site conditions can inform us about siting across the region. The next slide, please. They've also, all of these technology selections and the location of deployments play into costs and generation opportunities. So fixed versus floating again. These two different technologies require different types of port facilities. They can be deployed at different locations in the lakes, but they also have different costs. So knowing how those costs fit within in the context of the portfolio is an important part of this project. Also, understanding how to bring those costs down. What could the state be doing to advance the development of these technologies and become a leader in the economic and capture the economic development opportunities associated with these technologies developments? And additionally, power production estimates play into costs. The more energy that can be produced per capital cost of the installation of the turbine, the lower the cost of the renewable energy coming back to New York. So cost and cost reductions are a key part of this project. Additionally, we're very interested in the economic development opportunities associated. So there are jobs associated with the construction and the operation of these projects and the maintenance associated. There are workforce assessment to make sure that our workforce is accurate or appropriately trained to be able to provide these services, and an assessment of the port infrastructure necessary to support them. So these things go hand in hand, the relative cost and generation potential of the turbines, as well as the opportunities for the construction and the jobs that come out of it. I just want to take a moment to include here that this is a feasibility study. The intention here is to get our arms around all of these different issues. We will not be going out and collecting new site condition information, but we will be taking that information that's available and running it through models to make these estimates. So it's going to be somewhat of a projection of energy costs and a projection of those timelines. So all of this is based on existing data, but we will be analyzing that data perhaps in new ways to inform thinking. Can I get the next slide, please? On the grid side, we are working with a team of Patera and the Brattle Group. These two groups have been engaged in a larger renewable energy grid study, the power grid study that was made available in January of this year. And they're going to be taking their expertise learned through that process and converting it to think about how the energy from Great Lakes wind could be incorporated into New York's grid to assure that as that energy is generated, it's distributed to the load where necessary. So they're going to be looking at primarily the interconnection opportunities associated with the existing infrastructure to assure that those projects can get the energy where they need to be in the most cost-effective manner. And additionally, looking at the deliverability of that energy. So the ability for that energy to not just connect, but actually be distributed into the grid in a way that's effective. So that is a key part and may also play a bit into the siting of where projects can be could be sited if the technologies and the costs associated make sense in that regard. Can I get the next slide, please? And again, the third group we're going to be working with is the Advizian-Worley group. This group is going to be working on a diverse number of factors. So initially, we're thinking about the permitting process here. In order to build a project, an individual developer will have to go through a permitting process. Permitting processes exist for this, but there may be some complications, particularly because we're working in the Great Lakes with adjacent states and in fact, Canada to our north. We want to think about how those different permits can work together to assure that we're doing this efficiently. And there are some other things that are kind of unique to these conditions. So for example, in order to secure an interconnection approval agreement from the New York State Independent System Operator, the proposer or the applicant needs to have site control. How would an individual developer gain site control in the Great Lakes that would allow them to file that interconnection application? So again, this study is not going to pave the way for being able to do that, but it is going to identify issues like that the state will need to consider if it wants to advance Great Lakes wind in an effective way. Additionally, we're going to be looking at existing knowledge about wildlife and habitats and the risks and opportunities appropriate to those topics. And on the flip side, they're going to be working very closely with NREL on other geophysical and geohazard conditions that may inform siting or siting constraints around the lakes. Get the next slide, please. Expanding a bit on the risks and benefits associated here. On wildlife, obviously there are a lot of folks that are very concerned with avian risks associated with wind turbines. And in fact, it was shown to be a major problem for the Icebreaker project off of Cleveland. So we are going to be aggregating data about how wildlife use the space and as well as other users. By that, I mean the shipping community, as well as the recreational fishing community, day boat sailors, and a whole host of other folks. So we want to understand how do folks use the space and how would the installation of turbines in different spaces affect their enjoyment of that. And for wildlife, for example, we want to look at stressors and receptors. And by that, I mean different aspects of a renewable energy project can have different implications on wildlife. So for example, in the case of wind turbines, the installation of a foundation can create noise in the lake, which may have an effect on the fishing community, but that noise is temporary. While a turbine operating in the space for a long period of time is going to have differential effects, perhaps on avian life or bats. And so we want to think about the duration of the effect on those different species, and in fact, which species could be affected. So a migratory bird who will move through a turbine array in one migration to the north each year and one migration to the south has a different risk profile than wildlife who may be loafing around those turbines or feeding around those turbines for extended periods. Those are all important considerations. So knowing which species are moving through, how much time they'll spend interacting with those machines, and the relative risks associated are important considerations. So we're going to take an initial pass at that using existing data and knowledge and think about it in that regard. Additionally, we're concerned with historical and cultural areas and making sure that we're not in conflict with those. So this can include shipwrecks that are in the lakes, as well as view sheds from historic sites. So that will be included in the study as well. And we're going to be also taking a pass, and this will tie back to the grid study, at public health benefits. So if we can connect and remove fossil fuels from generating electricity and replace them with Great Lakes wind, there's an air quality benefit associated with that and a commensurate public health benefit associated with that. So we're going to do our best to understand what those benefits are as well. And then an important factor, clearly an important factor to the general public from the filings of the Public Service Commission is visualization and visual impacts. These are very difficult to quantify. A lot of other things are quantifiable and understandable. Viewshed is a very personal perspective. We are not going to be saying what your perspective should be in our feasibility study, but we will be creating visualizations of different tech, that is different size turbines, and at different distances from shore. So we want folks to be able to see, to be able to understand what the viewshed impacts could be like and what the options are around those viewshed impacts. So for example, a fixed foundation can be installed to a certain depth. Floating depth foundations have a greater diversity in where they could be installed. And so we're interested in both presenting even-handed data about what those visualizations will look like, but also to hear from the public about their perceptions of what that visualization means to them. Can I get the next slide, please? I think we went too fast. Back up one. Oh, I'm sorry, you were right. And so with that, I'm gonna turn it back over to Cheryl to speak to our efforts to gather information from the general public. Cheryl?
Thanks very much, Greg. Appreciate that. So there are multiple resources the public can use to follow the progress of the study. NYSERDA has a dedicated Great Lakes Wind website that will be updated regularly, and it will include more information about the topics mentioned in today's webinar. If there is a specific comment or question you'd like to share with our team, we have our dedicated email address as well, greatlakeswind@nyserda.ny.gov. So please email us to reach a member of our team with those comments or questions. All of the emails are read by us directly, our team members, and we will respond within a few days. On the website, there's a form to fill out to join our email list and receive regular updates on upcoming webinars and opportunities for public feedback. Subsequent public webinars, such as this one, will be offered in May, August, October, and at the study's completion in early 2022. Please stay tuned for the announcement of those dates, which will be published on the website and sent via the email listserv. Our team is available for one-on-one engagement for your community, agency, or organization, and we will be tracking those engagements to ensure input from all Great Lakes stakeholders. Next slide, please. And now we'd like to hear from you on how NYSERDA can best interact with you and your community on the study. A poll will appear on your screen in just a few minutes, and there are 5 choices to choose from to indicate your preference on how to communicate with us about the study. You can select as many as necessary. 1 or more is fine. And here we have outlined a number of virtual options. Of course, in today's COVID world, we would like to have in-person informational sessions, but such as our ability to meet with people one-on-one, that we have presented here a number of virtual options. If we have missed something, please include that in an email to us, and we will consider that for a way to communicate with you and the public. So go ahead and see if we can get this poll published. Great. So hopefully up on your screen and in the right-hand column, you'll see the question and the options. So please take some time right now to indicate your preference. And again, you can select 1 or more of these options. And we'll publish this in just a couple of moments to see what everybody is thinking and how you prefer future social and public engagement on this study. It's important to mention too, that your answers will probably be recorded as an individual, and not right here, we won't show that to you, but we behind the scenes will have that information and can reach out to you as well. We're still working on this, so please go ahead and do your final answers now. I think we've got about 10 or 5 more seconds for the poll to be up. All right, I think the limit has been reached, and if our folks can go ahead and publish the results, that would be great. Just bear with us as these get pulled up. So as you can see in the same area where you conducted the poll and selected your choices, we have some results here that are preliminary. It looks like a lot of folks are interested in the website and email options that we've outlined here in this section of the stakeholder public feedback preferences. And then we also have a dedicated public webinar to hear from folks. And that's something we will definitely consider setting up as well for the future, as well as a public feedback period on a draft study. And it looks like there's interest in all of these types of methods for communication. So we will, of course, continue to proceed with all 5 and then really focus in on the ones that folks who have at least attended this webinar seem to be most interested in. And all of those opportunities will be posted to the website in the near future. Okay, I'll take the next slide, please. Thank you for participating, everyone. As for next steps, the principal investigators of the study are hard at work and diving into the data that will inform the study. We will be incorporating the results of the poll into our outreach strategy and will share additional opportunities for engagement in the coming weeks, as I've mentioned. The next public webinar on the study's progress will take place in May. And please sign up for the email updates and check the website for those details. The dates for the full year will be announced very soon. Of course, you can email the team at any time, as I've already mentioned as well. Can I have the next slide, please? And with that, we have reached the conclusion of today's presentation. We will take the remaining time to answer your questions that have come in, and I thank my NYSERDA colleagues for their time and in describing aspects of the study and the state's climate goals. Thank you for attending today's webinar, and we'll take some questions. I have here, will this presentation be made available? Yes, this presentation and the webinar are being recorded, and the slide deck as well as the recording will be available on the NYSERDA Great Lakes Wind website in the coming days. Next question is, where can I go for the most up-to-date information on the study? As we've mentioned here, there's going to be quarterly virtual updates via this type of webinar forum that are going to highlight the latest findings from the study research team. These updates will also be posted to the dedicated NYSERDA website on Great Lakes Wind. So as I've mentioned numerous times, please sign up for the email list on the webpage so you'll receive those announcements and those announcements for updates to the webpage, as well as announcements for future public participation opportunities. And let's see, I'm going to go to another question here. Adrian, I'm wondering if you could help answer the question, will the study consider whether any development should be private or public, I believe is what this question is asking. Is that something you can answer for us?
Yes, gladly, Cheryl, thanks very much. So as described, the study, again, in its foundational sense, is in and of itself non-directional. This is really an information gathering exercise that the state is initiating as a first step in understanding this resource and all of the various and understandably complex pieces that go into its consideration. It is our understanding that the implementation options that would be addressed subsequent to the publication of the feasibility study will be delivered to the Public Service Commission per the October order for the Public Service Commission's ultimate review. They are anticipated to be the parties making a determination as to the review of the study, of the contents, of the opportunities and of the challenges, and reviewing to determine next steps in the context of the state's renewable energy policies overall. And so again, just to reiterate, this is a non-directional study. It is a foundational study to look at the feasibility of this resource, but particularly the composition, whether public or private advancement of this resource has not yet been determined and would be part and parcel of the Public Service Commission's next steps in their deliberations and review. Perhaps while I've got the microphone, Cheryl, it would be helpful to pivot to another question that has come in. There is a question here. What approvals are required to support the siting and permitting decisions? So as Greg very kindly outlined, the Advisian scope of investigation includes the development of a table that is intended to comprehensively identify the requisite permits and approval agencies that would be necessary in order to develop a project in the Great Lakes, including both the offshore aspects, so those water-based areas, but also including onshore questions and deliverability ultimately to the grid. And so clearly those are all very important questions, the intersectionality between potential state involvement, local involvement, municipalities and the like, all of which are important for us as a state, but also for stakeholders and the general public as well, to have a very clear understanding of the various approvals that would come into play in the advancement of a prospective project. So that is anticipated very much to be part of the Advisian scope.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I'm going to move to another question here. How will the study examine environmental justice issues as it relates to the feasibility of Great Lakes wind? Greg, I was wondering if you'd be interested in taking that question for us.
Sure, thanks, Cheryl. And I'll actually going to combine that. There's a couple of questions as it relates to environmental justice and viewshed issues. And in a sense, they're taken together. So the study is considering, obviously, environmental justice issues and concerns. This relates to not just viewshed, but also to port development work, job opportunities, air quality implications, and related. So we take environmental justice community considerations very seriously. And viewshed is obviously one of those considerations in that process. As I mentioned in my presentation, this study does include a viewshed analysis, and your individual perceptions of those viewshed impacts are unique to each individual. But obviously there's a threshold at which a majority of folks are concerned with viewshed issues. So this study is not directional. It's not saying that projects should be built at some set distance. What it's trying to do is aggregate information about the implications, and in the viewshed's case, to demonstrate what viewsheds how the viewshed could change as different technologies are deployed at different distances from shore. Again, this is designed to help the Public Service Commission decide what to do as a potential next step in the process, not to say what we think is the appropriate viewshed. So on the viewshed issue, and that was coupled also with a property values question, which is fairly typical. So again, we are not saying what the viewshed distance would be, and we will not be translating viewshed to property value impacts, but obviously the consideration of viewshed on property value, as well as just the public's enjoyment of a natural environment, are important considerations in this study. Building on that, one of the questions went into the expected capacity factor for the turbines in the lake, nameplate capacity of those turbines. And so what I would say is we are going to be looking at technology assessment with NREL to try to understand that better. So offshore wind turbines are much larger than we would reasonably expect to be deployed in the Great Lakes, simply because they can't be transported there. And so the size of the technology is something that will be in that consideration factor. Obviously, the size of the technology goes to viewshed, it goes to the port infrastructure that's necessary to support the projects and so forth. So as I say, these individual components of the study are very tightly coupled in a very dynamic way. And on the viewshed topic also, what could the state be doing to show more concern for New York lakeshore residents? And in fact, that's exactly why we're here. We want to hear from you if you are in support of, what aspects of this project you are in support of. If you are not in support of, then we'd like to hear what brings you the most concern. And if you're just trying to learn, if you have questions that we can help inform, so you can formulate an opinion on Great Lakes wind, we'd like to hear from you as well. So we are in fact here to learn from you, as well as to tell you what we're trying to do in this project. And I'll just finish with one that was in relation to sediments and potential resuspension of pollutants from those sediments. So one of the aspects of this project is to try to understand where those sediments are. And so trying to catalog and provide a spatial map of areas that we would be concerned with. And also the technology assessment can result in very different resuspension of sediments. In some cases, you can have, in pile driving, you can create noise and create resuspension. But resuspension is also a factor of running cables back to shore. So the longer the cable runs, the more sediment disturbance you will have. So that goes into how close or how far turbines would be located from shore. But going back to the foundation component, depending on the foundation types, we have there are fixed foundations in the form of monopiles, but there are also fixed foundations in the forms of gravity-based, which are which don't disturb the sediments nearly as much. And so again, we're not directional on this. We want to understand those risks and call those risks to the attention of the Public Service Commission. But we are not being directional in that we are going to be dealing with resuspension. It's just one more factor in the set of factors that we need to try to understand and put forth in this project. Go back to you, Cheryl.
Thanks very much, Greg. There are a number here of questions on the study itself, so I'll get back to you, but I'll give you a moment here there to take a breather, and I'll take a different kind of question. The stakeholder involvement, the one-on-one, would that include homeowners? And I'm going to turn to Adrian, but I will reiterate what I've mentioned before, is that we would like very much to hear from all of you during potentially a public Q&A session in the future. So Adrian, I was wondering if you had anything to add to that question.
Thanks, Cheryl, and really you're right on. You know, we are very eager to hear from stakeholders and from members of the public throughout this process. You know, without your input, it is very difficult for us as a state to have a fulsome view of the potential, again, opportunities and potential challenges. You know, the exercise here is for the state to be eyes wide open and well equipped to understand, you know, the potential opportunities and challenges of this resource, and input is critical to that process. And so, you know, per the communications that Cheryl, you outlined through this webinar, in the communications per the email address that we have ongoing our website, the activities with regards to public webinars, you know, these are all important aspects. We would love nothing more than to be able to be more physically present and to engage. You know, when we look to many of our different resource and programs at NYSERDA, you know, open access and, you know, open houses and the like have been foundational to our communications. We have to bear that in mind currently with the ongoing circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic. Appreciably, we are eager for input, but we are also mindful of our need to work with communities in a way that helps to promote safety overall. And so, you know, we'll keep an eye on that over the coming months. In a perfect world, we would love nothing more than to be able to, you know, host an open house and to get to meet you one-on-one and to hear more about your perspectives. But we'll have to balance that, of course, with the need to steward public safety. And so, again, we look forward to your proactive engagement. Again, our sincere thanks for joining us today on this webinar as an important kickoff to this dialogue and the means by which we have in place to be in touch. And we will look forward through subsequent webinars to sharing, you know, should circumstances be evolving, so as to promote you know, deeper levels of access and communication. Clearly, that would be where we'd all like to be in the not too distant future. So stay tuned is what I would say in that regard. And clearly, many of the important viewpoints that we do hope to gather through this process speak to homeowners and local residents, you know, recognizing that this is a conversation about your community. And so we are eager to make sure that we are hearing directly from you. So again, our thanks for joining us today as an important kickoff to that process.
Thank you so much, Adrian. I have a few other questions here that are related to planning. So while I have you, if you don't mind indulging me here. Sure. There was one question that asked when the feasibility study would be completed, and I will reiterate what was presented here, that time frame is going to be the end of 2021, early 2022. But I also have a question here. Is it too early to be asking questions around future RFPs or leasing processes for the Great Lakes wind areas?
Thanks, Cheryl. Indeed, that is a premature discussion. I think we've said it a few times now, but to say it again, we need to look at this resource open-eyed and objectively, and to start with collecting data that will be foundational to our state's posture. We are not, through this study, initiating an RFP process. This is not a request for proposals. That's what RFP means. Really, it's about foundational data to help us understand and articulate the resource, to articulate the ways in which potential prospective projects could be developed. What are the things that foundationally need to be considered by the stakeholder, by the states, by stakeholders and the general public. So this is an exercise in helping us to get our arms around all of those potential factors and considerations, so as to contemplate what our posture as a state may be for the implementation of this as a potential new resource within our clean energy mix of technologies, which again, when we're talking about 100% clean by 2040, and as Doreen offered in her opening remarks, we need to be continuously self-reflective as a state as to what are the potential technologies that can help us to achieve those goals. And some of those we know of today, and some of those are the subject of future innovations. So we are continuously at NYSERDA, research and development is in the name of our authority title, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. We are perpetually questioning, what areas of innovation are coming to fruition, what technologies can the state be thinking about, and we need to offer that information to the public as a means by which to make informed decisions. State policy relies foundationally upon solid science and data, and that's what we're here to start with.
Thank you very much. Okay, I have another question here. More about, will the study evaluate transmission needs to support Great Lakes wind? And I believe, Greg, you spoke about the transmission aspect of the study that Brattle and Pitera were conducting. Do you mind maybe giving a little bit more detail to that question?
Yeah, we're obviously looking at how can Great Lakes wind be integrated into the system and distributed to the end users. This is oftentimes framed as a local issue in that energy, renewable energy is being produced in Western or Northern New York and being pushed to New York City. But in fact, the rationale behind the state's goals for renewable energy are predicated in the fact that climate change is affecting all of us. And a transition to a clean renewable fuel is going to provide benefits at the local level as well as on the regional and global scale. So the intent here is to really push back on climate driving forces. But additionally, the study is considering co-located potential economic development benefits associated with Great Lakes wind as well. So the energy needs to flow to the end users, regardless of where they are. But the sites around the lakeshore and the ports in particular and the maintenance jobs would be associated with projects themselves. And so what we're trying to understand here, again, as Adrian suggested, this is not directional. What we are trying to do is gather information and frame it in the way that folks can understand the risks and opportunities, the benefits and challenges associated with Great Lakes wind, and make sure that we understand how that dynamic process works together. So if we are going to advance, if we look at the economics on one hand, we should look at the environmental impacts on the other and make sure that we're being thoughtful and comprehensive in that perspective. And that's the intent of this study.
That's great. And while I have you, Greg, a question came in about, will the study consider cultural resources, including ancestral connections?
Yeah, so we are absolutely considering cultural resources in this, both submerged and terrestrial, and thinking about First Nations in this process as well. I would say though, and I maybe I said this in my earlier presentation, the feasibility study, as you can tell, has a lot of components to it and a lot of dynamic components and a relatively short time frame to pull it all together. So we are going to be endeavoring to gather the information that's available on historic resources, but it's not necessarily going to be every aspect of the story entirely. We could spend a lot more time on this. And I think it really goes back to this feasibility study is going to identify those risks and opportunities and put them forth in a feasibility study that the commission can say, okay, we think this is interesting, but we need to do more work on this aspect of it, or we're concerned with that component of it, and more work could be done at that point. So this is a very broad-based study that in a sense could scope issues and opportunities in more detail, but it is not necessarily comprehensive in all ways, getting as much detail as is possible through much more detailed studies.
Thanks very much. I have a question that came in here comparing this study to the offshore wind master planning process. So Adrian, I was wondering if you could describe a little bit more about how this feasibility study relates to the offshore wind master plan out in the ocean.
Yeah, glad to. Thank you, Cheryl. And that's a really great question. As I think we mentioned during our remarks, Great Lakes wind is indeed a very different resource than offshore wind. When we say offshore wind, we are talking about the advancement of wind turbines in the Atlantic Ocean to service our goals under the Clean Energy Standard. And there are many things that were part of that sentence that are important to note. So when I say it's a part of the Clean Energy Standard, I mean that is an active program that the Public Service Commission has looked at, has examined the opportunities, the challenges, the costs, the benefits, and has specifically implemented orders to advance that technology and to specifically advance the realization of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind in the Atlantic Ocean by 2035. There are many pieces of that puzzle that are, from a regulatory perspective, very different than what we're talking about when we speak about a feasibility study for Great Lakes wind. But it's also important, I think, as a potential reinforcement of how foundational data and science and investigations are. When we looked at offshore wind as a major resource for the state, again, turbines being built in the Atlantic Ocean, we spent a lot of time as a state working out the foundational elements of that resource through our comprehensive publication of the New York State Offshore Wind Master Plan. That has, both specificity in terms of foundational knowledge, but also directionality, and is a different framing than again what we are here describing today with regards to the feasibility of a Great Lakes wind resource. And so it is conceivable that if the Public Service Commission, were to review the balance of information that is provided through this feasibility study, that they would take up additional steps and instruct NYSERDA. But we don't know. That's premature to say. So it is conceivable that this is the beginning of many studies. It is also conceivable that the Public Service Commission, takes a very close look at our resource mix and the opportunities that are afforded, and concludes, in any number of different ways at this point in time. So we don't provide this information in a way to be, again, specifically directional. Rather, we're speaking about a very foundational posture here and grappling with all of the available resources. And that is consistent with the precepts of the Clean Energy Study, which is to look on a statewide basis. How can we achieve our goals? And what is the core information that enables us to make smart decisions?
Thank you so much. So we're just about out of time here, and a number of questions have come in that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to today. But I want everyone to know that they have all been recorded, and we will be working behind the scenes to be sure that these questions are addressed and they're answered. A final question that I do have is related to that process. How will stakeholders and the public be able to communicate with the researchers on inputting their knowledge into the study? And I can answer that by saying, please stay tuned. We plan to, based on your interests, we plan to be very involved with the public in inputting those questions. I believe that the contractors who are conducting the study are on this webinar right now, and there will probably be an opportunity for them to present some of their initial findings at these future public webinars that were outlined during today's presentation. So I definitely encourage you to register for those and attend when we have that ability to speak directly with them. And that will be by no means the only opportunity. We will be sure that not only these questions, but other questions that are communicated to us through the website and through email are sent to them, and there will be we'll figure out what the process looks like for following up. So with that, I would like to say thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, or this morning, but now this afternoon, for the first in the series of webinars on creating the Great Lakes Wind Feasibility Study. Have a wonderful day, everybody.